culture, the plants usually stay small, like not really small, but like compact for 3 or 4 leaves because they're growing in these flasks with hormones. Well, I saw some out there, a few that had 3 or 4 leaves. Is that those?
No.
No, those.
Those are my own seedlings that you saw on the floor of the smaller greenhouse. I take them out of the plugs and then I move it. It goes from a well-rooted plug to the 5-inch pot. So those were only done about 3-4 weeks ago that I put them in those pots. That's why they still look small in that pot.
Fine, but the time it gets like 4 or 5 leaves, the leaves start getting like really big. So how do you keep it compact like and small like
it's
that?
Still a small, immature plant. Each one will grow out successively more. But the fact is, yeah, there's 4, 5, 6, even 7 little leaves on it.
Yeah.
You know what that is? That's a very robust growing seedling. It's just a happy seedling, and it takes energy and a root system underground, which you can't see it, but that's a minimal root system. As that root system grows, if you don't have the root system on the ground, it's not going to push the big leaf up. Think about this. When you have the seed, is the first thing that happens the root goes down or the leaf comes up?
The root goes down.
Exactly. Which is more dependent on the other then? The leaf is dependent on the root.
Yeah.
Those don't have enough roots yet having developed, certainly not getting beyond the little plug into the 5-inch pot to get bigger leaves. They will. You come back here in a few months, those will be in a pot with nice full leaves.
So mine they shoot out a root and then they put out 2 or 3 leaves slowly, but like by the 3rd or 4th leaf, it goes from like this big to this big. So mine must be focusing on roots.
You got pretty good roots going underground. And that's an indication that your roots are really good. And that your light may not be as good as it should be.
Okay.
You're growing inside? I bet you that's it. If you did a foot candle measurement, how many lumens, what your plant is really seeing, if the light is insufficient, it makes a longer, lanky leaf trying to spread out and get more light, saying, I'm hungry, I need light. A smaller, compact, smaller leaf plant, but that's tight with many leaves, is a sign of good light. If you ever grown in shade, you get bigger leaves, not because they're more lush or healthier, but because they need more light. They're saying, give me light. So it's a balancing act between the roots underground and the light above. In an ideal setting, what's ideal? Bright filtered light, but of the wavelengths of all the wavelengths.
Can you tell me about this living wall?
Sure. The living wall is actually a real living wall. And that's probably because Florida lacks verticality. We don't have mountains here. We barely got hills. Basically everything is flat. So while a wall is contrived, it's not quite as contrived as the living walls you may see available that can be grown in an apartment, where a wall may have different layers behind which you can't see, where the roots are supported, put water down in there, and it could be actually growing into a contrived wall. But the living wall here is in fact made out of our ground rock, which is limestone, coral rock, and it's just piled up. That living wall started, the one we saw earlier today, about 33 years ago, and it's coral rock against a concrete block wall, but one that if it was just the raw rock, limestone is very alkaline, probably wouldn't be the right environment for plants to grow in, especially ferns. First you need moss, the core layer underneath, and in fact that happens by time, by giving it something to start growing from, which in this case is actually a mixture slurry of peat moss and, believe it or not, buttermilk. Buttermilk, especially old buttermilk, mixed with peat moss and even some manure for nitrogen, can make into a slurry. If I paint that on that rock wall and then I keep it moist, in Florida's environment, that will start to grow moss. That substrate, moss, is what allows me to start putting ferns on there. Remember, ferns are not growing from seeds. Ferns are from spores, tiny little microscopic things. Before there were seeding and flowering plants, there were ferns. And those ferns from their spores rely on what? Not an animal to move it from here to there, but the wind. A little breeze will take that spore and take it from one plant and then now let it just fall in another place where it can start to grow from there. Many, many more spores than seeds. That's nature's advantage. But in fact, there, the vector for how it's moving from one place to the other is a little gentle breeze. The wall there started with very few ferns that have naturalized and basically spread themselves to all those places. And it's not just ferns. In the wall, we have aroids growing, certainly anthuriums, begonias, other oddball plants that I say don't fit into any given group. But they make their own mosaic, in a sense, so that the living wall is in fact living, breathing, makes a beautiful backdrop.
Why buttermilk?
Because as it gets old, it releases things that allow a good substrate for moss to grow on. For a while, it gets a little stinky with the manure, but once you start seeing the mosses that naturally grow under the right conditions, that little carpet of moss is ideal for a spore to land on and then to be able to root, because that moss, unlike the rock itself, holds on to moisture, and it's not as alkaline as the coral rock itself. So you're actually creating a more favorable environment, including through the chemistry, because plants are different than people in a very important respect. It's called pH, but it means how acidic, or in this case, basic alkaline in its chemistry, plants like conditions versus you and I. You and I, we actually have, our blood is slightly alkaline, but plants actually prefer slightly acidic. And I say slightly because we use a scale called pH. You ever heard of pH? Mm-hmm. pH is what's called a logarithmic scale. It's not an integer. One is twice half of 2. But what happens then, a pH of, say, not 7, which is neutral, but 8 is considered alkaline, but it's actually many-fold less acidic than if you went the other direction from 7, say, to 6. But here's the important part about plants. You and I may live in a slightly alkaline world. Plants prefer a slightly acidic world for most of the unusual plants we see. Some are adapted to alkaline settings, but for the most part, a pH of around 6 is important for a plant, because at that particular pH, the plant itself can absorb more of its nutrients than in any other pH setting. And that's key. It's not only nutrients, it's what's called micronutrients. Okay. So a healthy, balanced plant that's looking not to be artificially fed would be looking to position itself in its particular most favorable acidity, which is a pH of closer to 6. And so that wall with the mosses provides that ideal setting, which is why it grows on its own naturally without me doing anything other than keeping it fairly moist. But there's the next variable. Moist with what? Water. As nice as it is in South Florida with humidity, and that right now, since we're speaking in the summertime, it's almost too humid for our comfort, the plants love it because it gives them the moisture they need to thrive. However, we have 2 seasons in Florida, not like where people come from where they have 4 seasons. Ours are considered as wet and dry. Not as much of a change winter, summer, but the fact is the summer months now are our wet season, and it lasts 5 months from about June through October. But come November, if you don't have a way to continue irrigating and the rains stop until the following June, those 7 months are months when the plants can really start to suffer.